Let me tell you about my story. My name is Mrinalini Bose. At 70, Mrinalini Bose lived in a quaint cottage on the outskirts of Kolkata. A retired professor of literature, she had made a conscious decision. No remarriage after losing her husband at 50, no financial or emotional dependence on anyone, yet a life filled with purpose and joy. Many had advised her otherwise. You need companionship, they said. What if you fall sick, they worried. But Mrinalini believed dignity lay in self-sufficiency, not in tying herself to another person out of necessity. Her days were simple yet fulfilling. Mornings began with yoga on her sunlit veranda, followed by a strong cup of Darjeeling tea. She had invested wisely in her younger years, ensuring financial independence. Without any children, she had named an NGO as the heir to her estate, a place that worked for women's education. She spent afternoons at the community library, mentoring young students. She had started free literature classes for underprivileged girls, believing that knowledge was the greatest inheritance she could pass on. Evenings were for herself, reading, gardening, or simply watching the sunset with a quiet satisfaction. Of course, there were moments of loneliness. Festivals sometimes brought a pang of nostalgia, but she had learned to fill those voids with meaningful connections. She had built a small yet strong circle of friends, other independent women, a few younger students who saw her as a guide, and even a stray dog she had named Rumi. One day, a former colleague visited her. "Aren't you afraid of being alone in your old age?" he asked. She smiled. "Alone, yes. Lonely, never. I have my books, my mind, my students, and my freedom. What more do I need?" Aging with dignity, for her, meant choosing her own path, one not dictated by societal expectations, but by self-respect and fulfillment. And in that, she had truly won at life. As the years passed, Mrinalini's life remained as she had intended. Graceful, independent, and deeply fulfilling. She was now in her late 70s, and though her body had begun to slow, her mind remained as sharp as ever. Her free literature classes had grown into an informal school of sorts, where young girls from underprivileged backgrounds came to learn not just about books, but about life, confidence, and self-worth. One evening, as she was tending to her garden, a young woman approached her. It was Asha, one of her earliest students. She was now a journalist writing about social issues. "Ma'am," she said, touching Mrinalini's feet, "I've always wanted to write about your life. People need to hear your story." Mrinalini chuckled. "My story? My dear, I'm just an old woman who refused to live on anyone's terms but her own." "But that's exactly why it's inspiring," Asha insisted. "You've shown that aging doesn't mean giving up, that life can be fulfilling even without the traditional crutches of family or dependence." Reluctantly, Mrinalini agreed to share her journey. Over the next few weeks, Asha visited regularly, taking notes as Mrinalini recounted her experiences. Losing her husband at 50, rejecting the idea of remarriage, securing her finances, and building a life that was entirely her own. She spoke of the struggles, the judgments, but also the immense freedom she had found. One day after their session, Asha hesitated before leaving. "Ma'am, do you ever regret your choices?" she asked softly. Mrinalini smiled, gazing at the setting sun. "Regret comes when we live by others' expectations, not our own. I chose dignity over fear, purpose over dependence. And in that, I have no regrets." A few months later, Asha's article was published in a leading magazine. It was titled "Aging with Dignity: The Unwritten Rules of an Independent Life." The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from women across the country. Some widows, some single by choice, others trapped in lives they no longer wanted. They all saw in Mrinalini a reflection of what was possible. But life had one more lesson in store for her. One winter night, she suffered a mild stroke. She recovered, but it became clear that she could no longer live alone. Friends and former students offered to take her in, but she declined. Instead, she moved into an elder care home, not out of helplessness but out of choice. It was a place she had researched years ago, ensuring it was well run, with dignity at its core. Even there, she remained the same Mrinalini, reading, mentoring, and inspiring others. Her presence turned the home into a place of learning, storytelling, and laughter. On her 82nd birthday, surrounded by former students, friends, and the staff who had come to adore her, Mrinalini made a quiet wish. Not for a longer life, but for a life that, until the very end, remained hers to shape. And in that, she found her final fulfillment. Mrinalini Bose had always lived on her own terms, and she wasn't about to stop now. Her move to the elder care home had been carefully planned, not an act of surrender, but a continuation of the independence she had always valued. She had spent decades shaping her life with dignity, and she intended to carry that dignity with her, even into the final chapters. The care home, Sanjhagar, was unlike the usual dreary institutions people often feared. It was built on a model of active and engaged aging, where residents weren't just patients but participants in a small, vibrant community. There were book clubs, music evenings, and discussions on politics and philosophy. Exactly the kind of environment where Mrinalini thrived. She quickly became a guiding presence there. Her students still visited her often, and her name now carried weight in the literary circles of Kolkata, thanks to the article Asha had written. More young women, inspired by her story, reached out, wanting to meet her, to hear her wisdom firsthand. One such visitor was Meera, a 45-year-old woman who had recently lost her husband. She sat in the sunlit garden of Sanjhagar, her hands twisting the edge of her sari. "I don't know who I am without him," she admitted. "For 20 years I was someone's wife. I don't know what to do." Mrinalini smiled gently. "Then it's time to rediscover yourself." "But isn't it too late?" Meera asked. "Never," Mrinalini said firmly. "Do you like to read?" Meera hesitated, then nodded. "Good. Come here every week, and we'll read together. Not just books but life itself." And so, another journey of self-discovery began under Mrinalini's quiet mentorship. The years continued to pass, and Mrinalini's presence in Sanjhagar became legendary. She organized poetry readings, started a small writing group, and even helped an 80-year-old fellow resident, Mr. Sinha, publish his memoirs. Of course, age did not come without its struggles. There were days when her body ached, when she found herself growing weaker, when simple tasks required help. But she never let it dim her spirit. One evening, as she sat watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, Asha visited her again. Now a respected journalist, Asha had written books, traveled the world, and was still deeply connected to Mrinalini. "You're still working magic," Asha said, sitting beside her. Mrinalini chuckled. "I do what I can." Asha hesitated, then asked, "Are you afraid of what's coming?" Mrinalini took a deep breath, letting the cool evening breeze touch her skin. "No, my dear. Fear comes when you leave things unfinished. I have lived, have loved in my own way. I have given and received. What more could I ask for?" Asha blinked back tears. "You've given so many of us courage. That," Mrinalini said with a smile, "is the only true legacy." At 85, Mrinalini knew her time was near. She could feel it in the slowing of her breath, in the tiredness that now came more frequently. But she had no regrets. One day, she called Asha and a few of her closest students to her room. "When I go," she said, "do not mourn. Instead, celebrate." They nodded, holding back their emotions. "I have left instructions with Sanjhagar. I do not want a conventional funeral. No rituals, no weeping. Instead, I want a gathering of people I've loved and taught, where you will read poetry, share stories, and talk about life, not death." Asha promised to honor her wish. A week later, Mrinalini passed away peacefully in her sleep, with a book by her bedside and the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside her window. Her farewell was just as she had wanted. People gathered not to cry, but to remember. Former students, friends, and even strangers whose lives she had touched came together, reading aloud passages from the books she had loved. They laughed at old memories, spoke of her wisdom, and celebrated a woman who had lived fully, fiercely, and without regret. And so, Mrinalini Bose left the world just as she had lived in it, with dignity, independence, and an unshakable sense of purpose. Her name became a story, her life a lesson, and her spirit a quiet, enduring force that continued to inspire generations after she was gone. Years passed, but Mrinalini Bose's name never faded. It wasn't carved in stone or written in history books, yet it lived in the hearts of those she had touched. At the Mrinalini Bose Learning Center, Mira's small reading group had grown into a movement. Women from nearby villages came, not just to learn how to read and write, but to reclaim their lives. Some were widows who had never handled their own finances. Some were young girls eager to study but held back by family. Others were simply searching for purpose. Mira often thought of Mrinalini during her classes. She would hear her mentor's voice in her mind, steady and kind. "You're not lost, my dear. You're simply unwritten." And so, she helped these women write their own stories. Asha, meanwhile, found herself drawn deeper into Mrinalini's philosophy. The success of her book had opened new doors: TED Talks, interviews, panel discussions. But something still felt incomplete. One evening, as she sat alone in her study, she asked herself, "What would Ma'am do?" The answer came easily. She didn't just want to write about change. She wanted to create it. A few months later, Asha launched the Mrinalini Fellowship for Independent Women. It provided scholarships to widows and single women who wanted to restart their education or build a career. The first recipient was a woman named Nandini, a 38-year-old mother of two who had been abandoned by her husband. With the fellowship, she enrolled in college to study law, determined to fight for women like herself. At the award ceremony, she stood before a crowd, holding back tears. "I never met Mrinalini Bose," she said. "But because of her, I believe in myself again." Back at Sanjhagar, Mrinalini's spirit still lingered. Every Sunday, the residents gathered in the library she had once filled with books. They read poetry, debated philosophy, and shared stories of their youth. "She taught us that aging isn't about waiting for the end," one of them said. "It's about living, right until the last moment." And so they did. Years later, Asha found herself back at the Mrinalini Bose Learning Center. The walls were now lined with books, the courtyard filled with women chatting excitedly about their dreams. She looked up at the framed photo of Mrinalini and smiled. "You were right, ma'am," she whispered. "Regret only comes when we don't live as we should." And with that, she stepped forward, ready to continue the work that had begun with one woman's quiet but powerful choice, to live with dignity on her own terms. The legacy lives on. Years passed, but Mrinalini Bose's vision continued to shape lives in ways she might never have imagined. What had started as a book, a learning center, and a fellowship had now evolved into a quiet revolution. The Mrinalini Bose Learning Center had expanded beyond its modest beginnings. New branches opened in small towns and villages, each offering women a chance to learn, work, and reclaim their independence. Some came to learn how to read and write. Others came to gain financial literacy or vocational skills. But they all came seeking one thing: a life of their own. One of these women was Anjali, a 55-year-old widow who had spent decades in the shadow of her family. She had always dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher, but after marriage, that dream had been set aside. At the center, she started attending classes. First, she learned how to read and write fluently. Then, she completed a basic teaching certification. And finally, one day, she stood before a classroom full of children, realizing that her dream had come true. "I thought my time had passed," she told Mira, tears in her eyes. But Mrinalini ma'am proved that it's never too late. Mira only smiled. She had heard this story before. Different names, different struggles, but always the same lesson. Meanwhile, Asha had become a force of change. Her work extended beyond books and talks. She was actively building networks for women's education and financial independence. One evening, she sat in her study, going through letters from women who had read a life of one's own. Some shared their gratitude. Others asked for guidance. But one letter caught her attention. It was from a young woman named Tara, who had run away from an abusive marriage. "I read about Mrinalini ma'am," Tara wrote. "She gave me courage. I want to build a life of my own, but I don't know where to start." Asha put down the letter and knew what she had to do. A few months later, with the help of donors and women's rights activists, Asha launched Mrinalini Nivas, a shelter for women seeking a fresh start. It provided a safe space, education, and job training, ensuring that no woman had to feel trapped by her circumstances. The first person to walk through its doors was Tara. She arrived with nothing but a small bag and a determined heart. At Mrinalini Nivas, she found a home, a community, and a second chance. With the center's help, she trained as a social worker. Years later, she returned, not as someone in need, but as a counselor helping other women rebuild their lives. "You saved me," she told Asha one day. "No," Asha said, smiling. "Mrinalini ma'am did." Back at Sanjhagar, the elder care home where Mrinalini had once lived, her presence was still felt. Every year on her birth anniversary, the residents hosted a storytelling evening. People came from near and far to share how her philosophy had changed their lives. Asha attended one such evening and listened as a young girl stood up to speak. "My mother was a widow," she said. She was told her life was over. But she read about Mrinalini ma'am, and it gave her strength. Today she's a teacher. And I'm here because of her. As applause filled the room, Asha looked at the portrait of her mentor on the wall. Mrinalini Bose had never sought fame or recognition. She had simply lived with dignity and purpose. And in doing so, she had created something eternal. The impact of Mrinalini Bose's life was no longer confined to books, learning centers, or shelters. It had grown into something bigger, an idea that refused to die. Across India, discussions on aging with dignity, women's independence, and financial self-sufficiency became more common. Universities introduced courses inspired by her philosophy. Non-profits adopted her teachings into their programs. And in small towns, where the weight of tradition often crushed individual dreams, whispers of her legacy gave women the courage to think differently. One of those women was Kavita, a 62-year-old retired school principal from a conservative family in Rajasthan. She had spent her life serving others, her students, her husband, her children. But after her husband's passing, she was left feeling invisible, as if society had decided she was no longer needed. Then one day, she stumbled upon a copy of A Life of One's Own in a local library. She read it in one sitting. And something inside her shifted. Inspired by Mrinalini's journey, Kavita packed her bags and moved to Jaipur to start an education initiative for elderly women who had never been to school. Many called her reckless. Some accused her of abandoning her responsibilities. She only smiled and repeated what Mrinalini had once said. "Regret only comes when we don't live as we should." Meanwhile, Asha found herself at a crossroads. She had built the Mrinalini Bose Learning Center, established Mrinalini Nivas, and written a book that had changed lives. But she wanted to do more. One evening, while sitting at her desk, she picked up an old notebook filled with Mrinalini's teachings. As she flipped through the pages, one line stood out. "Independence isn't just about living alone. It's about living on your own terms." That night, a new idea took root. Within a year, Asha launched the Mrinalini Bose Foundation, a national organization focused on helping women, especially older women, become financially independent. The foundation worked on 3 key areas. 1. Financial literacy. Teaching women how to manage money, invest, and secure their futures. 2. Second, career training. Helping middle-aged and older women start new careers, businesses, or passion projects. 3. Dignified living. Creating sustainable co-living spaces where single, widowed, or independent women could live in communities of their choice. The first co-living home, Sanjha Sadan, opened in Kolkata, modeled after Sanjhagar. It was designed for women who didn't want to depend on their children or live in isolation. Within weeks, applications poured in. Some were from retired professors looking for intellectual companionship. Others were from women who had left unhappy marriages and wanted a fresh start. A few were simply looking for a peaceful place to grow old without judgment. One of the first residents was Nandini, the lawyer who had once been a recipient of the Mrinalini Fellowship. She had spent years fighting for women's rights in courtrooms, But now, she wanted to give back in a different way. She started offering legal workshops at Sanchasudan, ensuring that every woman who walked through its doors knew her rights. One day, Asha visited Sanchasudan to see how things were going. As she walked through the home, she saw women gardening, painting, reading, and discussing politics over tea. In one corner, she spotted a young journalist interviewing an elderly resident. She smiled, realizing that just as she had once written about Mrinalini Bose, someone new was now documenting this next chapter. Asha stepped into the common hall, where a portrait of Mrinalini hung on the wall. She stood before it for a moment and whispered, "Ma'am, you are still here. You are everywhere." As she turned to leave, she heard laughter from a group of women sharing stories. The sound was rich, full, and alive. And in that moment she knew. Mrinalini Bose had not just lived a meaningful life. She had made sure others could too. Not the end, just the beginning. The impact of Mrinalini Bose's philosophy continued to ripple across generations. What had started as a single woman's quiet rebellion against societal norms had grown into a movement. Her name was no longer just in books and discussions, it was in institutions, policies, and, most importantly, in the minds of those who had found the courage to live on their own terms. One day, Meera stood at the Mrinalini Bose Learning Center, watching a new group of students arrive. Among them was Riya, a 19-year-old girl from a rural village, the daughter of a widowed mother. "I want to be a writer," Riya told Meera hesitantly. Meera smiled. "Then you will be." Riya had grown up hearing stories of Mrinalini Bose. To her, she wasn't just a historical figure. She was proof that a woman could build a life of her own. She threw herself into her studies, devouring books and writing articles about women's rights in her village.